and welcome to today's lecture on the meaning of myth. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to take a look at the role of mythology, and in particular origin stories in the world, both ancient and modern. And mythology is not just about explaining and understanding unfamiliar phenomena, right? Like where lightning comes from and why the seas get angry. It's also about justifying the way the world is. So especially when it comes to like power relationships, right? Political and social hierarchies, gender roles, that sort of thing. So whether you're looking for the meaning of life or simply want to explain your missing homework, journey with me as we investigate the meaning of myth.
In order to ask deep questions about the role that mythology has played in the world, whether in ancient Greece and Rome, or in East Asia or Central America, literally anywhere, it's necessary to first define what mythology actually is. And while defining terms might not be the most interesting task in the world, it turns out to be quite interesting when it comes to the concept of mythology, especially when you think of it as compared to something like religion, or legends, or folklore.
Now, I want you to do something here, right? I want you to think about for yourself what mythology actually is, right? Think about it for a second, go get a piece of paper and a pencil, and, jot down your idea. Now, don't go look it up on Wikipedia, right? Don't look up the right answer. Go with your gut feel what you actually think mythology is.
There are a few fairly common answers to this question. Mythology, to many people, is simply what we call religions we no longer believe in. If, for example, people still worship Zeus and Hera, we'd call it Greek religion rather than Greek mythology. But other people might say that mythology is fake or untrue, while religion is the truth about the sacred realm. But all these definitions lack objectivity. That is, what could be mythology to one person could be religion to another person.
Instead, I like to think of mythology as focused on stories, right? The stories associated with religion. Now, religion's a complex beast, and it's got stories, but it's also got belief systems and dogma and rituals and hierarchies. And stories are just one part of that. And so with something like the Bible, the creation of the world in 7 days might be considered a myth. Whether you believe it's true or not, under this definition, it's simply a story associated with the religion. And the same would go for the origin of the Greek cosmos, or the Egyptian understanding of the origin of the universe. And speaking of these origin stories, let's go ahead and take a look at some of those.
Let's start at the beginning. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the concept of origin stories and the roles that they play in ancient and modern world. Now, in one sense, origin stories are exactly that. Stories that describe the origin of things. But it's important to think about what that really means. When we say the origin of things, that implies that origin stories could be about the origin of anything. It's not just the creation of the universe, although that certainly is one kind of origin story, but it could be about the creation of people, or society, or animals, or cultural customs. Nearly any sort of thing could have its own origin story.
So when we talk about origin stories here, we tend to refer to things like the origin of the universe or the origin of a certain people. But origin stories can refer to pretty much the origin of anything, right? You might think back to the first time you stepped foot on a basketball court. You could have an origin story about that. Or the origin story for finding your academic passion, like classical mythology. You could have an origin story about that. Origin stories apply to just about the start of anything you can think of.
One of the interesting things about origin stories is that nearly all cultures, in all places, in all times, have some sort of story about where they, and the world or universe more broadly, came from. And any anthropologist will tell you that it's awfully hard to find things that everyone does outside of, the basics: eating, sleeping, and mating. So it's curious that people throughout history have developed elaborate tales about events they likely knew very little about.
So we seem as a people to have some deep-seated need to know where we came from. And in large part, this is because it determines who we are now and our place in the world. And this starts to get at the question of why we have origin stories. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few reasons behind the legends.
So why do people all over the world bother to come up with elaborate stories about where the universe and their people came from? Well, there are certainly multiple reasons, but one of the biggest is the fact that where we came from often defines who we are. And this idea of identity definition is incredibly important, both in the ancient world as well as in the modern world. Nearly everything we do, what we believe, who we hang out with, how we make a living, all these things are inextricably linked to who we feel we are and how we fit into the larger world.
Now, think about this in the ancient Greek world, right? This is a world of chaos and danger and warfare. And politically, the Greeks are a bunch of independent city-states, right? They're all separate from one another. But what a common origin story does is it gives them something common to unite around, ally around. And so if somebody from the outside comes in and tries to take their land or resources, they have something culturally in terms of a belief system that unites them together to fend off that threat.
So knowing who we are gives us a sense of confidence, a sense of place in the world, a sense of meaning and purpose, a freedom to pursue what our group finds valuable and find protection with those who are similar. And one of the core ways to build that identity is to believe that you and your group came from the same place. Hence the idea of a communal origin story playing a key role across the ancient world.
Now, one of the things that origin stories often do is tell the beginnings of particular cultural customs. So in Greek religion, you might think of something like sacrifices to the gods, or in Christianity, something like baptism, especially anything without a really obvious functional aspect to it. And in addition to telling the origin of those things, it also helps build identity bonds amongst the people who believe in those cultural customs.
In addition to building a shared identity amongst the people who believe in the same stories, origin myths also explain the way the world is. In antiquity, this frequently included explanations of the mysterious facets of the natural world. Why are there earthquakes? Oh, that's just Poseidon striking the ground with his trident. Why are there volcanoes? Oh, that's just Hephaestus at his forge. Why is there lightning? Zeus must be angry and hurling thunderbolts again.
Now, you can imagine how important this was in the ancient Greek world, where there wasn't really a scientific understanding of what caused a lot of these phenomena. And this especially applies to something destructive, right? If you just feel like it happens randomly, you have no control over it. But coming up with these origin stories, well, it gives you a way to pin down at least why you think something's happening. And so then to avoid something bad, you can actually have some agency, right? Pray to the right God, make the right sacrifice, and then you can at least feel as though you're preventing something bad from potentially happening.
These explanations go for cultural traits as well as natural phenomena. In some of our earliest Greek texts, we get the explanation for the origin of the sacrifice to the Greek gods. Namely that it builds off of Prometheus's deception of Zeus. Prometheus laid out two dishes, one full of rather unattractive looking meat, and one full of glistening, shimmering fat. Zeus, of course, chose the fatty portion, thinking it would be the tastiest. Instead, however, the fat merely covered the dry bones of an ox. But the precedent for sacrifice was set. Bones and fat were sacrificed to the gods, while people kept and ate the meat for themselves.
So think about this a little bit for yourself, right? Can you think of any kind of origin story in your own life, right? Perhaps being born, perhaps something else, right? Going off to school. Speaking of school, any origin stories related to what you're interested in academically? Start thinking about that sort of thing.
Frequently, origin stories don't just explain natural phenomena or cultural practices, they can also justify the way the world actually is. And this is especially important when it comes to reinforcing power relationships. The key question, of course, is why should some people get the vast majority of power and money and respect, getting to tell other people what to do and when to do it, while other people labor hard and take orders and have vastly smaller amounts of wealth? Why do they put up with it?
Now, of course, one answer to this question might be sheer force, right? If somebody's going against you, you can always call up the army and have them arrested or thrown off a cliff or whatever you want, right? But that turns out to not be a very efficient way of doing things. If you have to constantly call the army to keep your people in check, well, you're not going to be the leader of that place for very long.
Instead, origin stories can play a key role in establishing the naturalness or normalcy of power imbalances. The founding myth of Rome is an excellent example. After 500 years of shared republican rule, the new Emperor Augustus is the first person to secure sole power in Rome in half a millennium. And part of the way he justifies this is with the origin story of the Roman people, which his court poet Virgil writes are descended from Aeneas, one of the heroes of Troy. Aeneas, in turn, is the son of Anchises, who had an affair with Aphrodite. Thus, Augustus's dad, Julius Caesar, and thus Augustus himself, are both descended from the goddess, thus justifying his power and not so subtly hinting at his divine ancestry.
Now, let's take a look at this in the modern world. So some people might consider the American dream a myth, right? The idea that if you work hard, you can get a good job and make a lot of money and be really successful. They might consider that a myth that justifies the extreme wealth that certain really, really rich people have in today's society. Other people might consider socialism a myth, right? A myth that prioritizes equality over hard work. And either way, both of these things might be myths that justify the way the world is today. So it's really interesting that people all over the world, now and throughout history, they all have origin stories. And these help people bind together and develop shared identities. And part of what they do is they explain unknown phenomena, but they also justify the way the world is. Just a few takeaway lessons you can learn from the meaning of myth.